Well, Alex, thanks so much for taking the time to be on the show today. We're going to talk about podcasting, kind of your entrepreneurial journey, all that sort of thing. But I want to start with this. Out of all the side hustles and businesses that you've started over the years and you've attempted that have not worked, which one, if you look back, man, to this day, you're like, I wish this thing had gotten traction or had worked out better?
Yeah, Dylan, first off, thank you so much for having me. This is a question that I actually premeditated. You warned me about this one, which I'm thankful for. So the rest of this conversation, I'm sure, will kind of flow. But I was like, wow, that's interesting. And I say that because I've had a lot of different things, side hustles, like most entrepreneurs. Most of what we do doesn't necessarily work out. That doesn't mean it's a failure. It just means, hey, you're taking stepping stones to figure out what works, what doesn't, kind of your lane in it. And that's part of business. That's part of entrepreneurship. The one that has stuck with me, I don't think I've ever shared this before, but right before launching the current software that I founded, me and another partner were developing something. We were just calling it church groups. And we realized that there wasn't really any software at that point that could help churches, ministries actually build out a small group model in a similar fashion to something like meetup.com was doing at the time, where it's basically like, hey, here's the map. What kind of group are you looking for? Let's find something in your area. And so we had started developing that. And I was leading a small groups ministry just a couple of years before that at my local church. And my wife and I kind of built it from her having a group, me having a group, and ended up with, I can't remember the exact number, but right around 90 different people leading groups under us. And connecting people was a very manual process. And so it was like, man, there's got to be something we can do here. And we just couldn't find anything at that point in time. So years after passing along the leadership of those groups, we were still like, hey, let's try to build something. And it's right when the software that I now run full time really started taking effect. We started it and stuff like that. So it's something I had to not do, but I would have really liked to have built that out just because it's something that I really, really believe in.
Yeah. So you've done a lot of different things. Maybe we could talk briefly. I'd love to talk about PodMatch and how we got connected and that sort of thing. But maybe we could talk through kind of your entrepreneurial journey. So you started when you were selling golf balls. Maybe you can share that story, and then we'll kind of go from there.
Sure. Yeah. When I was cute and 10 years old, you can get away with selling used golf balls on a golf course. It's funny, a lot of kids were selling lemonade at that time, and I remember just having like a different mind, and this is probably the first tell that I was an entrepreneur, but I was like, ooh, I want to sell lemonade like they are. And so I set it up in the corner with, I have 3 younger brothers and a bunch of neighborhood friends, so we were all like sitting there, and I'm the only one who wasn't excited about the money we were making. And it's not because I wanted more money, but it's because I immediately realized this is not profitable if I had to pay my parents back for the material, right? Like, I'm thinking, okay, the lemonade mix, like I tracked it all. I was 10, which sounds maybe crazy for 10-year-old. Everyone's like, dude, we made $1 today. I'm like, we lost $9.50. What do you mean we made $1, right? Like, and so maybe that was my first thing, but I just remember being like, okay, I don't want to do this anymore because it just doesn't seem like this doesn't make sense as a 10-year-old. Now, I'll never forget though, I saw a golfer hit a ball in the water. And I was just like, man, they all do that, because we were next to the golf course when we did this. It was like in a neighborhood golf course. And I'm like watching, like, man, we're selling lemonade. They're over there hitting golf balls in the water. And then one day I actually found a golf ball that was just sitting there. There was no golfer around. I picked it up, and some golfer rides by in a cart and he goes, hey kid, what does that ball say on it? I said, Titleist Pro V1. And he's like, I'll give you $3 for it. And that, Dylan, was the moment I realized this is the right business. So we just set up shop. We started digging through the lakes, grabbing all these golf balls. And every Saturday morning, me, my brothers, and some neighborhood friends would all build out this huge system to be able to sell used golf balls. And you can get away with that as long as you're cute. When you're not cute and someone says, that golf ball has my initials on it, give it back to me. You can't really get away with it anymore. So for a couple of years, that was a fun little thing that we were doing.
How did this work with the golf course? Did you have to sneak in at night, or they were fine with what you were doing?
Yeah, as long as we were there after hours, they never cared. Again, cute kids, you can get away with it, right? Wow. So there was always people fishing in the lakes as well. It was like one of those things that after hours, it was perfectly fine. So, which worked out good for us. We're all kids in school, right? So after that was done, when it was getting a little bit dark, now I think back, we should have been wearing snake boots, and we should have had some adult supervision to look out for gators, because I live in Florida, where they're everywhere. Thank God we never had any issue. But I kind of think back, I'm like, man, parents in the 90s, they were a different breed.
Yeah. That's funny. Yeah. I mean, speaking of cost effectiveness, obviously there's time, but there was no cost for your materials. It literally was just, you found it and you sold it. So that was your beginning. Now you've done a lot of stuff, and I'd love to talk about, I know we talked about the church small group things, now what you're doing with PodMatch, but you're pretty successful. I don't want to get it. I don't want to share the story. Why don't you kind of talk through, as you got older, the different things you tried, and maybe what you were dreaming about in your 20s as you were kind of starting all these businesses?
Yeah, sure. I'll kind of fill in the gaps from 10 to 12, right? At some point, you're not cute anymore. The golf ball thing ends up going away. Actually, what happened is it just happened to be the right timing. Somebody was a golf ball collector, which I didn't know that was a thing, and offered to buy everything from us, including like all the little bins we had because we hadn't separated by its stuff, offered to buy it all. And that was sort of our out. So we gave the guy literally everything. And then we were like, okay, cool. We're done now. And
you sold your first company when you were 12 years old. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, I did. I didn't pay taxes on it either. Don't ask me how we got away with that. So, but fast forward throughout like high school and stuff like that, I was always really intrigued in online type of businesses. I got really good at computers, and that's right when they were really coming online. I remember my family got one, and I was very intrigued by it. I wasn't the kid who took apart the computer, but inside the computer, I was like, how does this thing work, right? The internet came out. I'm like, how does this work? And eBay happened to come out around that time, which is an auction website. And at that point, it's changed a lot, but it was strictly auctions. And I was like, man, me and my friends like to play with G.I. Joes. We like to play with Legos. And people pay money for some of these rare ones that we've got. And so I just turned to this kid that was like flipping stuff on eBay. I'd buy a lot. I'd fix them up. I'd sell them again. All kinds of things. Any way that kids like at school wanted this, right? There's all these different things. I was like, okay, I can buy a set of those and sell it. And I just really enjoyed that. And that actually landed me an opportunity later on in my high school years to do what's called virtual tours of homes. And it's not like a walkthrough of a house where someone's following someone with a camera, you're explaining. It was actually where you could just drag an image, look at the roof, look at the room around you, and go room by room for real estate. So I built out a software with another partner, someone a bit older than me, and we kind of built out this whole thing of like having photographers, editors, and we were posting directly the MLS on behalf of realtors. So you could go, and that's before Zillow was a thing. This was like kind of very like this was like the future being built with this. And so that's kind of like my later high school years. And then I got into some real estate investing, and then ultimately ended up in a career, a 9-to-5, believe it or not, for a while. But that's kind of like my entrepreneurial journey into my very early 20s.
Yeah. Was this, I'm just curious. So they were sending you like images, pictures, and you were kind of making it into like a walkthrough with just like still images.
Yeah, it was the way we designed the software is if just imagine you're like in, I don't know, just a normal square room. They would take a full 90-degree angle picture of one side, and then they'd flip it around exactly to the same spot and take a picture of the other half. We'd stitch that together. So it basically makes this circular image. And with a mouse, you could just drag all directions, look at the roof, look at the floor. You could move everywhere. And it was some of that tech is like more common now if you go to like a website like Zillow. But at that point, this was like groundbreaking. Like nobody had anything like that. So people that had this other house, it was typically really high-end luxury homes because it was a bit more of an expensive service as well. And actually, I liked it so much, it got me into investing. As soon as I turned 18, I bought my first rental property because I was like, this is so cool. I want to get into it. And I just knew real estate was going to be on my path at that point.
So buying rental property at 18, I guess this, it was pretty successful in what you were doing. It was going pretty well.
For a little bit, yeah.
Yeah. And how did that work? So did you go to college right after high school? Did you take a break a bit and do some of your businesses? What was your next step?
Yeah. So right when I was kind of getting into this, I was also just doing, I just like devoted to doing part-time school. So like I got out of high school, did okay. I was never really a great student. And then when it came to college, I was like, okay, I'm paying for it myself. I don't really apply for, I don't really I can't really work toward any of the help because I am making money. I have like a business. And so, yeah, I just started doing like little classes on the side as I could.
Okay. So yeah, I mean, you're from 10 years old until, college age, you're doing things, selling businesses, and things are going well. You have this dream. I think one of your dreams, was to be included in the Forbes 30 under 30 list. So kind of what happened? I mean, things are going well, and then you find yourself in so much debt that you have to like drop out of school. How did you go from like successful guy to this, and what did it do to you?
Yeah, you mentioned that Forbes 30 under 30 thing. I remember I think it was a dental office. And again, like I'm not trying to like date myself, but this is right before smartphones were a thing. So when you're sitting in a dental office waiting, you're twiddling your thumbs or you're looking at the magazines they put out there for you. And I just remember seeing like the 30 under 30 thing, and I made like in that moment I was like, this is what I want to do, and real estate is going to be my vehicle to get there. And Dylan, I knew that was going to be my path. Like I was like, I left there like no cavities and life purpose, right? Like, I'm like, thanks, Dennis. And, but what ended up happening is this was 2004, 2005. And anyone who remembers those years remembers what happened specifically to this industry. And at that point, most of us couldn't see it coming. I certainly had no indication of this happening. So I bought really high in the market. I had a business that was reliant upon the market doing well. And everything was in that basket. And so when that stuff crashed, dude, man, like my rental property, I ended up moving into the one that I had because it was either that or I was just gonna have to let it slide. And then the business itself that the partner had in it, I just gave it all to him. There was no money. We went from doing like, I can't remember the exact number, but something like 30 some odd tours per day. There was a team of 7 of us, if you include me and the other guy, and to doing one a week.
Oh, wow.
I'm like, we let everybody go. It was me and him. He was doing the photography. I was doing the editing. And I was just like, this doesn't make sense. Yeah. And so at that point, I dropped everything. And I got my dad at that point worked in the aerospace industry and had a bit of a name in the industry. And so I was like, hey, I need a job. Like, I know it sounds weird, but like, I need an actual real job. And I was like, can you help me with anything? And he's like, all I can do is get you an interview somewhere. And he goes, then you're on your own. So I'm very thankful I ended up landing a part-time job. It was a receiving clerk position, which I realized when I got into it was translation for I took out people's trash and broke down boxes all day. And it was a parts manufacturing company. So there was like little boxes all over the place. And it was a humbling experience. And man, I'll tell you what, like if I can describe that season of my life, that was like the most rock bottom I've ever been in my life.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So you're there. I'm assuming, you're dealing with all this stuff, the debt, the things break down. You probably still have this desire to kind of start and run things. So how did you deal with, how long were you at this job? And what was it like were you trying to like tell yourself, hey, I can't go and try this thing. I got to do this for a while. I got to get back on my feet. What was it like for you while you were there?
I ended up being there for 15 years. And at first, that was not the plan. The plan was like quickly figure this thing out and get back and doing my own thing. And man, like what really changed everything, I can just share this story very transparently if that's all right here. I grew up in like a quote unquote Christian home, but like I never really had a relationship with God myself. So it was like one of those things where it was just, as I got out of high school, started doing really well financially, building a business, I kind of turned into maybe who I was naturally without like God being with me. And so I had like bad relationships, like love interest relationships, and just my personal friendships as well. All that stuff disappeared when my business started not doing well because it was kind of just following the money, the hype that goes with it, right? Like all that. And so all those things like disappeared. And I was, like I said, rock bottom, man. Like I'm doing this really humbling job in my opinion at that point. And I was like, man, I got to get out of this. I got to figure this out. And I just remember one day I went to the mailbox and expecting to be all bills, and there was bills, but there was also a flyer for a young adults church ministry. And I looked at it for just a second. I realized the address. I'm like, this has to be like almost walking distance from me. Like looking at the address, I'm like, this has got to be just like right here. And typically I just throw something like that away, but for some reason I had this like feeling to keep it. And I'm like a really organized guy, so I don't have like papers anywhere, but I left it like in the corner of my kitchen counter. And so I just like left it sitting there. And I was like, maybe I should go to this. I was like, that's stupid. No, it sat there for 3 weeks, but I just couldn't bring myself to throw it away. But I was also too terrified to go. Yeah. And finally I just was like, I don't know if it was desperate or there was just some pull. And I still to this day can't really explain other than the fact that like I felt like God was like pulling me. And so I remember walking in, I decided to go. Walking into the building, as I was walking in, the thoughts that were in my head were, when they find out how much of a failure you are, they're not going to like you. You're not going to be accepted. You've never given God the time of day. God's not going to give you the time of day. And these are all the thoughts literally going through my head. And man, the only way I can describe what happened next is I just showed up and felt God for real for the first time in my life. And man, did it change things. And the people that I was meeting, I got into some small groups instantly. Like someone met me and I was like, this guy's cool. I got into a small group. They really loved and wanted to support me for who I was. And man, I was like, people like really doing this thing. And man, like at that point, to bring this back to my career, instead of saying I got to get out of here, I said, you know what? If this is where God has me, I'm just going to do the best I can while I'm here. And I don't know how long that'll be, but I started operating at what now is a coined term called an intrapreneur. So an entrepreneur within an organization. And there's many very popular authors that have written books even about that. So I became that key player in the organization from day one. And it was all just because my life radically changed. And yes, I describe this as like the worst time of my life, but it quickly, the pendulum swung to becoming me stepping into who I really was, my true identity, and finding more joy, happiness, and fulfillment, even though like it took me more than 10 years to get back to that level of financial freedom in my life, but it didn't matter anymore. And so, and I actually ended up loving the career I was in. Like I had an absolute blast. So that's kind of that whole journey. It's a little bit of a long-winded story, but I hope that really blesses somebody listening today.
So I'm curious then, by the time you turn 30, you're in this job, You're probably doing good. You're doing well. You're part of this church, doing the small group thing. When you turned 30, did you have any thoughts of that dentist office when you said, I wanted to be 30, under 30, and then you realized, well, that's not going to happen?
You know what? I kind of did, but it wasn't like the age that made it like click for me. That was the year I got fully back out of debt. And so I was like,
Wow.
I remember telling at that point I was married, and so still am. And so I told my wife Alicia, I was like, man, have I ever told you I had this like dream to be this Forbes 30 under 30? I'm like, I'm 30 and I just got out of that mess. Like it took me like almost 10 years to like get out of that. And I just, of course, thanked her for being part of the solution. She came into the relationship with no debt and positive assets and stuff like that. So, but so I thought about it, but not for the reason of like, oh, I'm 30, I didn't make it. It was like, wow, that was my dream. And I just now like got back to zero to try again.
Yeah, that's great. So you're at, this aerospace thing for a while. Now you started PodMatch, which is, you also like to help people create podcasts, that sort of thing. Before we maybe talk about PodMatch, how did you get into podcasting and what was your entry point into that?
Yeah, at year 12 of being in the organization that I was in. So, and again, listen, anybody who's checking this out, I wasn't an astronaut, skydiver, or fighter pilot. Like before you think I was something like really interesting,
although, can I just say, you say that, but you're not allowed to discuss what you did.
I know.
It's like government. So, you might be.
It was boring government. now no one's even going to believe what I say now that you gave up that. But we were parts manufacturer, focused below the atmosphere on different aircraft applications. And I worked my way up to the C-suite in that organization, which I'm super thankful for. So I was running an entire division of the company. I had 5 different departments I was overseeing. And most of it was, again, parts manufacturing and distribution. And so, and I really, really enjoyed it. Like it was a great job. But at year 12, the company went from being a small, mid-size, United States-based, privately owned company to a publicly traded Canadian company. Go figure. And so, the second it went public, I had this situation happen that I will really never forget because it really did it really shook me a little bit. But I was looking at one of my divisions of the company. At this point, we're part of a multi-billion-dollar organization. So it's a big business now. And I did something that saved a full 10% in one of the divisions, which was like big money. And so I was on the C-suite and I reported directly to the CEO. So I remember that day I saw the report come through, confirmed all the numbers. And I was like, man, I'm going to be the first one to tell my CEO about this. Like, this is sweet that we just did this, right? Like this was like a cloud 9 moment for me. Like we worked so hard to do this. I walk into his office, knock on the door, respectfully. Of course, in my mind, I kicked in his door. I'm like, yo, man, right? But I didn't actually do it. I was like, hey, sir, you got a minute? So I sat down and I was like, hey, did you see the numbers from Department X? And he goes, yeah, I saw them. And I could tell he wasn't happy about it. And I was like, so I kind of leaned in. I'm like, we saved a full 10% on this whole thing. And he's like, yeah, I know, I saw him. And really short with me, which is just not like him. We had a really good relationship. I was just kind of put my hands up. I'm like, well, what's wrong? And he goes, man, we didn't tell the shareholders that we were going to do that. We didn't tell the board we were going to do that. He goes, you can't change things that quick because we need to be able to tell people we're going to do it so we can be selling stocks at higher levels. And he had all these reasons. And he's like, and you did it so fast. What if it didn't work? He had all these things. And he's like, just don't do that again. And I was like, okay. And so I'll never forget it. That was the day that I had my first long walk in that building. Typically, I was super happy to be there, but and it wasn't that I was like, oh, this is the worst. But I remember walking back to my office that wasn't far from his, but I'm walking down the hallway thinking, I can't grow here anymore. I knew that the days of being, again, what was coined an entrepreneur, so an entrepreneur working in that organization, were over. I now felt more like a cog in the system. My job was to maintain the status quo, which just doesn't align with who I am as a person. An entrepreneur by heart, by nature, that doesn't work for somebody like me. Doesn't mean it's not a great position. Doesn't mean it's not a great company. It has continued to grow even without me being there. But I knew that my time was nearing an end. And that's a long-winded way of telling you I started exploring side hustles. I faithfully applied myself. I was there for 15 years, so it took me a number of years to figure something out. But I always like to mention this. My last year at that organization was my best year because I believe the way you end one season is the way you start another. And so I'm very proud and happy to say I left on really good terms. They brought me back multiple times to come speak to the organization, which is really cool. So I got left on good terms. But it did take me years to get out of there because I was like, okay, I'm a good entrepreneur. I'll figure it out. And everything I did seemed to fail. And ultimately, my brilliant idea, I'll just do air quotes on that, was, you know what? I need help. I'm going to start a podcast so I can talk to really smart people and figure out how they left a 9-to-5 job to become a full-time entrepreneur.
Okay.
And that is exactly what I did. I started just talking to people that had successfully done what I wanted to do and just heard their stories and journeys about it along the way. And ultimately, that's what got me into podcasting and everything else from there, because I really learned a lot from that.
Now, are you still doing that show?
No, it was called Creating a Brand. The feed still exists. My current podcast is called Podcasting Made Simple. Everything I do now is for podcast guests and hosts, but the first 158 episodes of that show they'll literally start off saying this is the Creating a Brand podcast. So if anyone is interested in hearing that journey, I kind of wanted to keep it on the same feed because I felt that it was still very valuable for people.
Awesome. So let's talk about podcasting. And I know not everyone listening to this is going to podcast or wants to podcast, but I do think it's cool to see, like, how does this actually work? So you started this, this first Creating a Brand, you do that first podcast. How did you how do I want to go this? Let's say this. Why did you decide to end that podcast after so many episodes?
Yeah, it was this moment where I realized, because I'm big on talking to listeners. That's something I've learned over the years. And it's one of the best things we can do as podcasters is find a way to communicate with anyone who is tuning in, right? And that can be a bit of a challenge sometimes. But for me, I just kind of figured out a few methods that worked, and including asking people on the show, hey, email me, right? And I was getting on calls and stuff with people. And I started to realize that my audience was shifting because I had launched PodMatch 2 years before creating a brand into Podcasting Made Simple. And I realized that it wasn't very many entrepreneurs listening anymore. It was podcasters who had come to really enjoy the software I had. And they were like, this does help a little bit. So I listened to it and I like hearing you. And it made me realize I'm missing a big opportunity to start educating within the field that I'm in. It was definitely like a sad thing. Like I did a big social media post about it, because I enjoyed it. Every week it was this great interview that I learned so much from every single week. But it was like, man, I can tell that I need to be devoting my time and energy to educating the people that are trusting me from a software perspective. So that was the whole decision behind sunsetting Creating a Brand and moving it to be called Podcasting Made Simple.
So you got Podcasting Made Simple. How long has that one been going for?
That was, I believe, February 2022 is when I made that shift.
Okay. And then PodMatch, when did PodMatch start? And why don't you just talk a little about what it is?
Yeah, sure. So I had the idea for it after speaking at a podcasting conference at the beginning of 2020, right before the world shut down. There's about 2,000 people in a room, and I happened to be on stage, and I just asked people what they were struggling with. And what I consistently heard is I'm having trouble finding the ideal guest for my show. People can find guests, but they're like, often they're like, it's my 15-year-old cousin who wants to talk about sports. Right. It's like he's not a good fit. Like I need to weed these people out and find the right ones. And I came home and I just literally thought, what if we build something that's like a dating app, but instead of connecting people for dates, it connects them for podcast interviews. So it puts the guest and host together that are an ideal fit. And so back before it was cool, we were using AI to build this type of thing. So simply put, the idea for PodMatch came on March 10th, 2020, and on June 15th, 2020, we launched. And literally, it's a service that automatically connects podcast, guest, and host for interviews. And that is the whole function that we have. And we've just done our best to simplify everything that happens between the meeting process, or right after the meeting process, the initial time of like first interaction, to the actual interview itself happening. And so that's the whole idea behind it and what it's been doing. So yeah, June 15th, 2020 is when we launched it.
All right. And at podmatch.com, even if you're not a podcaster, you can check it out and see how it works. I want to talk about like podcasting. One of the things you mentioned, I think some people might thinking they want to start a podcast, particularly maybe an interview style, kind of like maybe this one. When you first started your first one, you're reaching out to many of these people you probably didn't even know. And so and maybe that's part of how you started PodMatch. Like, how did you find these people and how did you get them to come on your show?
Yeah, it's changed. This was 2018 maybe was the year I was doing that, I believe. And back then it was a little different. People didn't want to podcast. So you couldn't really, it was very hard to convince somebody that the benefit of even being on a podcast. That has shifted. Now everyone sees the value of being on a podcast and they want to be there. Doesn't mean you don't still have work to do. It's just now you can leave out the whole, here's why you would want to be on a podcast. They know now. So it's like, why would you want to be on my podcast? And so that's what's changed. So I'll kind of leave out the first part of it, convincing people, because now you don't need to do that anymore. But actually explaining the value for them. I would always lead with value is the first thing I would do. And at first I didn't. I'm like, I'd love to have you on my podcast. Notice it starts with the word I. That doesn't say it has anything for Dylan. It says it has something for Alex, right? Yeah. And so I just learned really quickly, be like, hey, I see you just let out a new book. I just want to let you know I would actually do this. I just bought a copy. Here's a picture of me. I'm about to start reading it. After I read it, if it seems like it might be a good fit, would you like to come on my podcast to talk about your book? And that right there was more than enough. I very rarely had anyone say, no, thank you. It was extremely rare that somebody would do that. And so I just started building relationships with individuals. And back then, before PodMatch existed, I'll admit it was a hustle. I would devote one full day every month to reaching out to as many people as I could that were the right ones. I had people reaching out to me now, right? But like they were very rarely the right one. And I would always just use that same framework. And so I like to interview authors as well because I found that they were the easiest interview because they could stay on track very easily. If you're like, in chapter 4, you said X, tell me about X, right? It made it real easy. So I just like really targeted those individuals because, and I made sure they were around the idea of entrepreneurship, how their journey and stuff like that. So from day one, I just, my mindset, lead with value and make a very simple, meaningful request to invite them on the show. And that had worked really well for me. Again, it really was a hustle and a grind, but it worked really well.
Yeah, because it's one thing to like try to find guests and reach out, ask them on, but if you're reading like everybody's book, that's a lot of work. So how did you balance? I mean, was it first of all, was it weekly and whatever the cadence was? I mean, did you read everybody's book? How did you know like who to get and you know that sort of thing? Because that could take a lot of time.
Yeah, I like to read, and at that point, I committed to reading 365 books a year. I did not commit to that. I committed to 52 a year. Okay. Actually 50, because I would take the last 2 weeks of the year off. But I would basically do 50 books. I'd read them in one per week, which for me is something I actually really, really enjoyed doing. That was like one of the big benefits for me. So I'd read while I was in the gym, like between sets. I'd read while I was at the pool. Like I just really enjoyed. I enjoyed the act of reading. So for me, it wasn't a huge like I shouldn't say it wasn't huge. It was a big commitment, but it was something I was really devoted to because I was looking for to get into entrepreneurship full time.
Yeah. Question then, because you can reach out to guests and some will respectfully decline, some won't even answer. So were you reading like an entire book and then asking, or were you kind of asking first and then reading it before the interview?
Asking before the interview. So I had the book saying like I'm about to read this. I kind of like wait to see what would happen because I'm going to prioritize whoever I'm interviewing the next week. And so I typically try to get a little bit ahead, but like I always wanted to make sure I was interviewing who was coming up. And I wasn't buying all these books. There's actually still many websites you can go to see galleys of books that are planning on coming out. So you can get yourself an early release. And sometimes the picture I was taking, I was holding my phone with a picture of their book using my wife's phone. And that's like what I'd have to send them because I had just a digital copy of it. And also I never have had a problem with listening to books either. I also like that. So I could be running, doing something else and just being able to like listen, and I retain really well that way. But yes, I was not like buying everyone's book, reading the whole thing and then reaching out. It was like I had it somehow that I could show them, or hey, planning on getting your book next, something along those lines to show people, hey, I'm serious. Here's the meaningful request I want to make, and again, here's why I would like to have you on.
Yeah, and that's helpful too. You mentioned like NetGalley, and some of these, depending on like your niche and the authors you're interviewing, you can get on like their publication list where they have like the agents reaching out, and so like they're asking to be on, which can be helpful too. And then of course you got to decide if it's a good thing or not. But if you do it a while, some people will start asking you. They know that you're someone that does it. So you're doing that. I guess like, how did you find in terms of reaching out, what was the success rate, and maybe how would you? I know it's probably different per person, but what would you say, to an author to maybe give them incentive to come on your show? How would you word it?
Yeah. So at first, my success rate was really bad because I just didn't know who to target. I learned the people that are best to target are the ones that are actively promoting what it is that they're wanting to talk about, right? So LinkedIn was a big space for me, just professionals, entrepreneurs, like they hang out there. When I'd see an author who's literally like, this book comes out in 3 weeks, posting that type of thing, there was a pretty good chance that they were interested in more press around it, right? Like at that point, they're like ready to get it out there, and they probably have a publicist telling them, hey, you need to get out there, right? And sometimes they could find their publicists because sometimes they'd actually list that information. I wouldn't even reach out to them. I'd reach out to their publicist and say, hey, I see that Dylan has a new book coming out. Do you think he'd like to be on the show? And that's even easier because they're like, yes, I can look like a hero now for getting him booked on a podcast. So I just like learned the signs. If somebody has a new book out and they have never even posted on social media, they're not talking about it anywhere, they're probably just like, I'm just releasing another book, dude. Leave me alone, right? Like I need a break now because I'm just releasing. They don't care necessarily about the numbers, or they have such a big built-in audience. It doesn't matter to them, right? And so I didn't go for like A-list celebrities. I went for people that had the best content on what my audience would be interested in. Again, being in tune with the audience. And so I just learned who to reach out to really well. And you had another, it's kind of a second part of that question. Can you, I want to make sure I answer that second part as well.
Yeah, reach out to people. And how did you frame it in a way to kind of maybe give them incentive to want to say yes?
Yeah. So the way I would position it is through the lens of my listeners. So instead of being like, I would love to interview you because I want the content, because I want the episode, I'd say, hey, the meaningful request is my listeners are all early stage entrepreneurs that could really afford to learn more about leadership because they're going to step into a role really soon where they might even be managing 2 or 3 different people. I'd love to have you on because I think that their book would be something they'd be very interested in reading as a next step.
Yeah.
Positioning it that way, like there's almost no like, nope. Like people are like, oh yeah, that's exactly who I'm looking for. It's who I wrote the book for. You just told me your audience is aligned with that. And the call to action is me to grab the book. I'm in. Very rarely did anyone ever say no. And I'm not saying that it's because of who I was, but I was using the right words. And I think that so many of us today, we just take shortcuts. Like almost every day I get asked to be a guest on a podcast, which I'm humbled and thankful for. But typically it's like, hey, you want to come on my podcast? I'm like, I don't know. Like, can I actually show up and add value? Can I serve? And that's not the way you reached out. You had like concrete ideas for like what we'd be able to do together, how we'd be able to serve together, which just shows a level of expertise that you have. So I'm on your show. That same day, I guarantee you, I said no to 5 to 10 different people who were asking me to be on their show because they just didn't put in any effort at all.
Yeah, that's really good. Now, I'm just curious. It might be hard to think on the top of your head, but you've done hundreds of interviews. Is there one that was particularly hard or awkward that you look back on and you're like, that was painful?
Yeah, there's a number of them, but I'm laughing because there's one that stands out among the rest, and it is 100% my fault.
Yeah.
If you're going to be a guest on a podcast, you should listen to the podcast before you go on it. You should have an idea of what you're getting yourself into. And you know what? Just to even prove that, I'm going to call back one of your episodes. Listen, on the Dylan Dodson Show, if you go back to the episodes released on September 30th, 2024, you had Tim Donnelly, I think, is that his name? Tim Donnelly on the show, who is a daily radio host.
Yeah.
Listen, as a weekly podcaster, a daily radio host is like the hero in my book, like top to top. I'm like, how do you do that? You guys had a great conversation explaining like how he does the research, how he figures it out, how he's prepared for the type of guest that's coming on. Seriously, like if you just want to level up like as a communicator, I encourage you, go back to the September 30th, 2024 episode and listen to that. Again, I listened, but this is my bad experience was before I did that. And I just asked somebody, they're like, hey, I want you on my podcast. Red flag number 1. I ignored that. I was like, oh, this is like my second time being on podcast. I was like, oh, cool. What do you want to talk about? And they just said, I want to get into your business. Perfect. I'm ready. I'll be good to go. And I didn't look into anything. They do it live. So it's live over all social platforms. And there I was getting on the show. The opening question, Dylan, and I kid you not, was, hey, Alex, welcome to the show. Do you hold yourself responsible for your parents' divorce?
Oh, my goodness.
I was like, and I'm live. And I was just like, I thought you said my business. Come to find out, my business means the business of Alex Sanfilippo. He drilled me for my belief. He drilled me for having faith. He drilled me for voting everything. Like just went into it. And I was so nervous I didn't just leave, which is what I should have done. But it was like 45 minutes of this dude just coming after me. And I was like, oh man, I should have looked because it's live. And now I feel bad if I just disappear. And that's part of my people pleasing stuff. In reality, probably should have been like, hey, listen, this isn't working for me. Right. And just let it be. But man, that stands out as like still to this day, the most terrifying interview I've ever had. And here's the thing, at the end of it, we finished and the guy said, you're the first person to ever make me consider faith. He's like, no one has ever answered the questions the way you did. And it's not because I knew it all. It's because I was like, man, sometimes I was like, I don't know the answer to that. I'm sorry. Yeah. And he's like, you're the first person ever to respect it. But so maybe there was some good of it, but man. That was terrifying.
Yeah. So I do want to ask, before we started recording this, you mentioned you listened to a couple of my episodes and I'm thinking, oh, wow, that's pretty impressive. But you're also like, especially with PodMatch and running it and do it in the podcasting world for years, you get a lot of requests. I imagine then that's a lot of time. You're listening, like, how do you do all that? If you're listening to all these podcasts that you're on before you get on them?
Yeah, when I committed to doing this, I commit to 52 episodes as a guest per year. I've done more in the past, but now it's just one a week, and I do my best to keep them recorded on Wednesdays. And I have time blocked on Wednesdays and the week leading up, the 2 days leading up to it, the weekdays, to devote to whoever's podcast I'm going to be on. So I don't read a book every week anymore. I used to love to do that, but now what I do is I try to listen to as much as someone's backlog as I can. And what I'll do is I won't necessarily go through every episode. I'll find ones that are interesting to me and add into my queue. I don't actually subscribe to any podcast anymore, not even my own. I just say, who have I committed to this week? And can I learn who they are, learn their audience, and hopefully learn something myself from it? And I've really never been let down. Like, if you have like an abundance mindset and a growth mindset, it's pretty easy to find something you can learn about and it'd be interesting to you. So
Yeah.
it really doesn't take a whole lot of effort because I've committed to a cadence that's very realistic for me. It allows me to listen and learn new things about people, and I thoroughly enjoy this process, maybe even more than reading a book every week. I just find podcasting to be, for me, especially interview type podcasting, to be like just my jam. And I know that I retain very well when I listen to that. So for me, it's just like leveled me up as a human as well.
Well, so I want to talk about like starting a podcast, how to do that for those that might be interested and those that aren't going to do it, but they're just like want to know how it works.
Yeah.
I'm curious though, as we're talking like pragmatically, practically, before we get into that, you listen to a lot of podcasts then, probably a lot of interview-based podcasts if they're inviting you to be on the show. What are some things that, of all these podcasts you listen, like when they do well, this is like what they do, or the ones that aren't as good, here are the reasons why they're not typically as good.
The biggest thing I see is I can't fully put on the host. It's also on the guest, but I'm going to relate that back to the host as well. First and foremost, the host actually doing their research is huge. Like having an idea of who's coming on, how they're going to share, and then a host that's actually curious, like is actually interested in learning versus I have 10 questions I have to get through today, and if I don't get through them, this thing's a failure, right? And like you kind of laugh at it, Dylan, because you've done this for a while to know that that's like 101, but you'd be shocked how many people get into podcasting not realizing that. And so sometimes I'm listening to a podcast and the guest will tee up like the perfect next question to be asked that everyone listening wants to know the answer to. Yeah. And the host goes, wow, that's amazing. So I want to shift gears here and talk about your childhood, right? And you're like, what? Like, hold on, let's go back to that thought. I know the guest is like, oh, seriously, man? Like, I just gave you this opportunity. And sometimes some hosts are really good, but they don't bring on the right guest. An example of this, I actually know somebody personally, and he will tell you, he is like an alpha. He will cut you off if you have him on your podcast, and he is going to talk about what he wants. He has like 3 things that he is always going to mention, and he's going to rant about those things because he says his conviction, and he goes on podcasts for those things. And regularly, I have people be like, oh, you know so-and-so, like they did a terrible job on my show. And I never have said this, and this is sound really rude to say here. I'm like, no, they didn't do a bad job on your show. You did a bad job vetting them as a guest. They show up that way every single time. And the same can be said vice versa. Some hosts, they show up in a way that they really want to dive into things. And if the guest doesn't do their due diligence, they might be signing up for what I signed up for years ago with my bad experience, right?
Wow.
And so, again, I think that the best thing to kind of quickly like overview this is the host that's actually curious and isn't like married to a set group of questions, but they want the conversation to go in a very valuable direction.
Yeah, that's great. So let's talk about, speaking of like good conversations, good podcasts, starting one. I guess we could start it in a lot of different places. Maybe we can start talking about gear first. And obviously you can expand and grow, get more things as you do it. But like, what are some like basic things that you might need to get off the ground?
Yeah. First off, like the not the actual hardware, but the software side of things. I think that's what terrifies a lot of people. It's really easy these days. You go to a hosting provider, you sign up for the hosting provider, and they automatically distribute it to Apple, Amazon, YouTube, I mean, everywhere, right? It'll automatically happen for you. And so it's actually really easy. You literally schedule it and it will just go out when you tell it to with all the information you tell it to. So I think a lot of people get scared and they're like, I don't know how to work with Apple and Spotify. You don't actually have to. I use buzzsprout.com, not affiliated with them, but buzzsprout.com is who I use. And if you are like, okay, the technical side of starting a podcast, we're not really going to get into that today. If you want to know more about that though, go to just type in how to start a podcast Buzzsprout. That's how I learned, like 10 years ago or whatever it was, forever ago. But they update it every year. And so I still send people to it. So if you're like, I think I want to do this, that'll tell you all the computer stuff you need to do. Beyond that, the gear itself, like you said, Dylan, like you can work your way up. I'm using what I consider to be my forever microphone. It's a Shure MV7, I think. And then I have a Logitech 4K. I'm really simple and not great at the hardware stuff. Both these things are USB. They plug directly into my MacBook Pro. And that's how I run everything. I've got some like lights in here, all really simple stuff to use, but I worked my way up to it. The first time I did this, I was using the built-in camera in my computer, but I did have like a little external mic. And I always tell people, start where you are, like have some pride in it if you're going to take it really seriously, because that is your image, the way that you show up. But start with what you have. Start where you are, I think is a great way to do it. The one suggestion I want to give when it comes to a microphone, this will save people so much energy. You want what's called a dynamic microphone, not a condenser microphone. Condenser is great if you have a true studio. Not home, can't be at home. It has to be an actual studio that's like fully soundproof, because a condenser microphone, you can hear your neighbor 10 doors down from you walking their dog. Like it'll pick up everything and it'll cause so much stress. Dynamic microphone, which I'm using right now, if I step 5 feet away from this microphone and yell, you will not be able to hear me. And that just gives you peace of mind. Like I have literally recorded podcast episodes with my wife hanging out with a friend in the other room, and I left the door open, which was not maybe the best. Close the door, right? But you would never have known that they were there because they can't hear it because of the way the microphone is built. So a dynamic microphone on a website like Amazon, you can get a really good one these days for like $40 or $50, and that is like top tier. It sounds almost just as good as what I'm using right now.
Yeah. So doing that, and then of course for recording, I think you mentioned as well, I use something called Riverside. It's a little subscription. It makes it super easy. You can send a link to the guest. The thing I like about Riverside is they don't have to download any software. They can just put it in their browser, the URL, the link. But let's say, you got the mic and you could just, like you said, you could just start with your computer and a mic and, do that thing. Is there like, what do you have like a process that you recommend when it goes, there's like, you got to write the questions and then record, and then there's different things of editing. Like it seems like a lot. So like, what are the steps? How do you maybe go about, and you've been doing it for a while, but like, hey, from booking a guest to putting the show out, what does it look like?
Yeah, I just call this like our workflow. And by the way, I use Riverside as well. This is great. Like I use it for my solo stuff. I can edit inside of it if I need to. Like everything can be done right here. It's beautifully done. Set up so that people can really succeed with it, even if you don't have a background in this stuff. But for me, like what you're saying here, like from the time of like for me, it's time for a new episode. That's step one for me. Time for a new episode. 2, publish button has been hit, and everything that's post production stuff is all finished, like sharing it, all that stuff. Like there's this whole long process involved in it. And so to me, I look at that as like my workflow. It's going to be different for everybody, but I will say this, the first like time I actually organized it all, and I recommend finding a system, a tool to do it for you. Like don't put it all in sticky notes. Don't leave your mind up to remember it. Write it all down. The first time I wrote it down, after getting out of my head and off of a whiteboard and off of sticky notes, like I just said we shouldn't do, I had 100 items listed. And I think I maybe could put 2 together because I'm like, I like things to be, I'm like, ooh, 100, that's perfect. Instead of 101, could it be 100? Or instead of 99, could it be 100? That is way too many steps. I was doing way too much. Even if I was a full-time podcaster, that's ridiculous.
Yeah.
And so I've actually narrowed it down to 24 steps involved in the entire process. And they're like, I didn't even condense them. I just started cutting things out because the reality is we don't need to do everything we need to do to be a podcaster. I always say this, in order to be a podcaster, all you have to do is regularly release podcast episodes that add value to your listeners. You don't need a website. You don't need a blog. You don't need social media. Like you don't need any of these other things. Yes, add them if you have the capacity to do it. But the bare bones of this thing, if you're going to do an interview show, it's need a new episode, find the next guest, find the topic you want to cover, whatever it might be, right? Schedule time to record, edit, publish. And like that right there, like in its simplest form, that's technically all the steps that you need to do. And if you're listening to this and you're like really struggling with it, I'm not here to sell PodMatch. We have something inside of PodMatch called Workflows, though, that will literally give you a template, a very simple framework you can follow, or you can edit it yourself and build out your own. So Workflows is freely included in PodMatch, where you can literally manage your episode production. It automatically does like a checklist. You can just check it off as you go. And that's what we use. Me and my entire team use that for episode production. But at the end of the day, the best process is the one that you can do on a consistent, repeatable basis that doesn't overcomplicate things for you and just keeps it really simple.
Yeah. Now, when it comes to like scheduling out, I know people have different philosophies or how they do this. Do you recommend, like, how much do you recommend you be in your bank or be scheduled out? Like a month, a week, 2 months? What makes you most comfortable? What would you recommend?
Dylan, last month I was on a podcast, and the guy, we finished the interview, goes, man, that was great. He's like, all right, it'll be out tomorrow morning. I didn't say it, but man, I was like, well, what if I was sick today? Or what if I just pulled a no-show?
Right.
I always think it's important to have something in the bank. And I learned this the hard way myself. Back when I got COVID years ago, and it was kind of uneventful, aside from the fact that it completely wiped out my voice. And I don't mean for like a week. I mean for like almost 2 months. Well, I was only banking one month of episodes at that point. So it's the only time I ever missed podcasting was during that month, where I was like, well, I put post out. I'm like, I literally can't talk. Sorry, everybody. And like, that's obviously an extreme example, but at that point, I just decided the right number for me is about 13 weeks ahead. Wow. And I kind of let that dwindle. I'll batch everything, which I think is a great technique, where I'll record a whole bunch of them, and then I'll take a little bit of a break. By batch 13 at a time, get them all scheduled, literally 100% finished. I don't need to touch anything for all to happen for the next 13 weeks. And then I'll take 3 or 4 weeks off, and then I'll go back to build out the next 13. But I'm very rarely more than 20 weeks ahead. So it's usually between, I'll say, like maybe 8 at the minimum and 20 at max. It's something between there, at 13 being the goal.
Okay. And by in the bank, I guess I could ask, are they like done and ready to go, or they're just at least recorded?
They're fully, completely ready to
fully.
go. Like,
Oh,
yeah, I
wow.
have nothing.
Okay.
And I do have a team at this point. When it was just
Yeah.
me, I would do the things that were important first. So I'd batch it and be like, okay, all the recording, all the editing, now
Yeah.
all the titles, the description. Like I kind of do it that way. Now it's just like, hey, there's a whole pipeline. Again, we use workflows. So there's 4 of us involved on each of those workflows, and we just go one at a time and knock everything out on them. Goal being like, hey, when we're done with this batch, almost on the same day, all 13, we kind of hit complete on all 13 at the same time.
Yeah. Would it be possible to maybe just high level walk through like your current podcast, what goes into like a single episode?
Yeah, for sure. And if anyone is watching this, I forgive my eyes for wandering because I'm going to be like looking at this so I don't miss anything here.
Yeah, go for it.
Yeah, so I can go if you want, if it's helpful, I can go through all 24 things, or I can kind of skip
Sure.
around at a high level.
Oh, we can hit them.
Okay,
Either
cool.
way, we can hit them. Go for it.
So first thing I do is, I'll leave out a couple things. I pick the guest. I decide I need another episode, right? Those type of things. This is once that's been confirmed and stuff like that, and then it's been recorded. So everything leading up to there is pretty straightforward, right? Like I need a new episode. I need a guest. Find a guest. Schedule with them. Record. This is everything after that. The very first thing I do right afterwards is I come up with the title and description for the episode, blog post, all the things. And I also, so title and description, I do that right away because it's fresh in my mind. This helps me write an introduction if I need to. I just do that right away because I find if I step away, now I got to go back and listen to it all again to make sure I can remember it all and capture the essence of it, right? I don't have to do that if I do it right away. So that's the only immediate thing I do. From there, I either take a screenshot from our recording together, or I like memes. Sometimes I'll just grab a meme, something I can use, and then I'll create social copy as well. Again, I'm kind of doing this right away there. And then so I'll schedule like the social media stuff for it. And then I schedule that in our private community as well. And anywhere else, I'm going to blast it out. So if I'm going to blast out on PodMatch, which we do sometimes, or put it as in part of my email signature, all that stuff is happening right there. And if it happens to be like a new topic we've never covered, I actually add it into we use an app called Text Expander, which is a quick way to send out codes. So if I want to send someone a podcast episode, I'll add it to kind of like that queue. So someone's like, man, I really want to learn like an inspirational story, and I want to send them your podcast. Dylan, I would just be able to like type in a little code and it would automatically send to them. So I do that as well. And then from there, I upload it to Buzzsprout, my hosting provider. And I add that title and description I came up with and stuff like that. And I say me, this is me and a team. I'm not actually the one doing all this. It's somebody else as well. We developed the cover art for it as well. So we like the individual cover art for each episode. We like to have something really simple. And then at that same time, like we kind of create the placeholder because you can do that on Buzzsprout. And then the person editing the podcast will upload the final audio to it. We'll review it. Same thing happens on the video side. They upload to YouTube. We'll review it. And then we'll just kind of grab all the timestamps, the quick descriptions and stuff like that, the things that AI can do for us, and add all that to it. And then from there, we'll come up with a YouTube thumbnail, which you need at time of upload, and continue to go through this. Let's see here. We create a blog post for it as well. So again, going back to that title description, we'll actually develop a full blog post with the team for it. And then we will schedule it to go live on our website. So we have like a page devoted to our podcast. And so we like upload all that stuff there to basically have like the embedded, the audio, the video, the blog post, the images, all that stuff gets embedded there. And let's see here from there, keep on scrolling down here. We'll tell the guests. So we schedule something to let them know, and we'll kind of, we'll actually follow them on social media as well as like one of the steps. So we'll let them know in an email, but we'll also have already followed them so we can tag them in all the posts as well. And then we add that person to our CRM so I can remember to follow up with those guests, and that's the whole process.
Yeah, that's great. And it sounds like a lot too. I know we mentioned Riverside. They give you, I mean, you can edit them, but they give you descriptions, they give you timestamps, and they even give you social media like posts. Like they'll give you clips, which is what's really helpful.
Yeah, it sounds like a lot, and we adjust that. So like we use it, but we don't just say plug and play. We like pull that out and it's like, I don't really like the way it says this. We'll tweak it a little bit to make it our own, which I think is a best practice when it comes to AI. But yeah, most of that stuff is like 80% of our work is done with most of these tasks through automations these days.
Yeah. So, your specific podcast is about podcasting and how people podcast. That's pretty niche. How do you continue to find guests and content every single week?
Yeah, so I exclusively use PodMatch now,
Wow.
which was, I didn't do it first, but now I exclusively use PodMatch because the caliber of guests I was getting were just so much higher. They're people that are really devoted to being a guest and a host. And I just kind of look through their profile. I do most of the outreach. Sometimes people still reach out to be on the show, but it's mostly me reaching out to guests, which kind of is because it's so niche that I have to do the work. Like if I had like a general business show, I'm sure I have tons of qualified people reaching out, which would be cool. And I used to have that towards the tail end of creating a brand. But now I reach out, but I look for any unique angle I can find. So like recently I found somebody who is really good at helping business professionals write their bio, their short like introduction bio.
Wow.
And I'd never seen anyone who does that. And I just reached out on PodMatch. I was like, hey, I know like this is not necessarily professional, but like, could you help podcast guests write their bio so when the host reads it, it's not like putting people to sleep? And she loved it. And she was like, oh yeah, that's like a perfect application. And so she came on as a speaker in a very unique topic that maybe no one's asked for, but because our listeners are podcast guests and hosts, I know that that's one that's like, that would be really good. And someone's gonna be like, oh, I could afford to rewrite my bio. I rewrote my bio after she shared that because,
Wow.
and I thought I had a really good one. I was like, oh, I'm definitely missing some high level things here. So like, I kind of just, whatever piques my interest, being a podcast guest and host myself, I'm able to kind of go and say, ooh, this would be really interesting. No one's really covered that before.
Yeah. And then you go through this process. You record the episode, you get a lot of great guests. How do you go about promoting and growing a show? Particularly in the beginning, maybe if you don't have much of a social media following, I think there's part of it is like, my advice is like, you got to say, hey, I'm going to do this regardless of the downloads, at least for a while. You have to actually want to do it. But how do you like promote it and grow a show?
Yeah, I had some people on my podcast. I interviewed 3 people at once, just one time. It's with like a Buzzcast crew. They're the guys that run Buzzsprout. And this question came up, and they gave like a really good answer that I've kind of adopted when it comes to the stats. And by the way, if anyone wants to hear that, podmatch.com/episodes, type in what podcasting is really all about, and you'll see that episode. They shared some really good insights there. And that's podmatch.com/episodes. What they were talking about is at Buzzsprout, they were toying with a way that you could opt into a 90-day no stats challenge when you launch, and it would tell them, you could press a button and say, don't show me my stats for the first 90 days. And they didn't actually go forward with, but I kind of wish they would, because people that are 5 days into their podcast are like, why have only 10 people listened to it?
Yeah.
I'm like, well, you just launched, right? Like, and the reality, like, let's think about basketball. Like, how many professional basketball players picked up the ball at 25 years old and said, I think I can do this, and joined the NBA?
Yeah.
Right? Like, it doesn't work like that. Like, they did 18 or more years before anyone knew their name, of like grinding it out every single day to get to that level. Thankfully, podcasting doesn't take that long, but it really like bothers me when someone's like, I'm going to quit because it isn't working. I'm like, well, you tried it for 2 weeks. Like, what? You're not even indexed by search engines yet. Like, there's not even a way for people to find you yet. Like, it takes more time than that. So I always tell people, like, don't look at the stats. And seriously, if you want some encouragement on how to make that work, go back and listen to that episode I referenced. But I think like the best way to just start it off is to talk to anyone who has listened to it. Even if you have to start with friends and family, start talking to people, focus on continuous improvement, stay consistent with it. There is so much information out there that you're really not going to make it until you reach at least a 1 year mark, sometimes 2 years. For me, it took 2 years for it to really take off in a big way. And it's just because I was getting better all the time. But my favorite way to grow it from day one is use the right titles and descriptions for the show and for the actual episodes themselves. You want it to be descriptive enough that someone's on Spotify searching for it, it shows up because it's the words that you use. All the time I see podcasters, they name it like Alex 2.0. You don't know what that show's about. And if I make the episode a conversation with Dylan, you don't know who Dylan is or what we talked about. It tells you nothing, right? If Alex 2.0, I live in Jacksonville, Florida, near the beach. So if I called it like the Amateur Surfer Podcast, and you're an amateur surfer, you now are interested in that podcast. And if it says how to avoid sharks in the water, listen, if you're like an amateur surfer, that's your first question, right? And so it also goes to knowing the audience with what it is that you position. People find podcasts that way. And then the other thing I'll mention is just make it so good that people can't not share it, right? Like here's an example. I grew up with the TV show The Office. Or I guess I was in my 20s when it came. I don't know how old I was, but like I love that show. There is no episode of The Office where Michael Scott appears on the screen at the end of the episode saying, hey, if you thought this was funny today, please share this episode with a friend. And that's because whoever owned The Office at that point knew they didn't need to do that because it's so good. You are going to tell everyone you know and make sure you're going to follow up with them to make sure they watch it because they did that good with it. If your podcast is that good, it's going to get shared. It's going to get discovered.
Yeah. Now I'm curious. This might be something you've already mentioned, but what is the most overlooked aspect, in your opinion, of running a good podcast?
Yeah, I think it's really kind of getting what I just this is a good follow-up question actually, because it's kind of everything we share, like getting it all together. I find so many people, they do little pieces of this. They get the cover art really right, they get the title and description really right, but their content isn't great, or they're not consistent with it, or they haven't invested in any gear that sounds good enough for people to want to listen to on a continuous basis, right? Like it's putting all these things together, which can take a little bit of time, but if you want to run a really good show, you've got to get these elements right. And I find that the best podcasts kind of meet at this intersection of information and entertainment. even if it's highly educational, there's got to be an entertaining element. And I think that people that are doing really good with this now are stand-up comedians. If you look at the best stand-up comedians, they're not just telling jokes anymore. They're telling stories that might actually challenge you a little bit, and then adding like a little funny kick to it. And I think that we can all learn from that, because they're seeing that, oh, like people actually like to leave here with something they can be like, you know what I learned today from a comedian of all people? Like they like to share that. And so I'm not saying we all need to be comedians. You can just flip it and be mostly information with like just a little thing that's actually entertaining for somebody to hear along the way. Along with all these things I just mentioned, we can blend all that together. You can make something really good. The way that the glue that connects all this together, though, is actually talking to your listeners. The more you can put yourself in their shoes, the better you can position your show. Because if we're all just guessing and we get all these elements right, but we never talk to someone listening, are we heading the right direction? Right? Yeah. We really don't know until we start hearing from them. My show, Creating a Brand, took off at 2 years because that's when I got really serious about finding out how to better position myself to serve my listeners. And it felt like overnight from doing that, my show just absolutely took off because everyone started sharing it and listening to and binging every single episode.
Yeah. Speaking of, talking to people, when it comes to doing a podcast and maybe people start reaching out to you, like through PodMatch, for example, that's how we got connected. Like let's say you go on PodMatch and you say, here's my podcast, and you have people reaching out to you, like ask to be on. What's how would you recommend go about vetting? What's some tips for that about like, hey, someone wants to be on your podcast. You don't know them. You never talked to them before. How do you know that it's going to be a good interview?
Yeah, this is a really good question, because the more successful shows get, the more people start reaching out, just because they can kind of guess the numbers and stuff like that. So you'll have people that are not qualified at all reaching out. And PodMatch, there's not as much as that is like maybe the general market, just people like reaching out through DMs and stuff like that. So I can't really speak to that. On PodMatch, we're getting really aggressive with adding. Again, we've been using AI since before it was cool, back in 2020. But now we're having some front-facing stuff, because I always believe that AI is only as good as the information you feed it. We feed it really good information. And so now there's things that will actually on PodMatch tell you where the synergies might be or might not be. And so for me, that does most of my work for me by reading a single paragraph and seeing that. But also, I really read a lot into the pitch. Like, how did a guest reach out to me to be on the show? What is their expertise? And like even today, I had somebody who like looks like they'd be a really fun guest, but their entire focus is speaking to corporations about interjecting more happiness into their meetings. There is just no way I can make that fit. Like, not my wildest dreams, got to come up with some angle. And so on PodMatch, make it real easy. There's a pass button. So I just say, hey, I love what you're doing. I always like to write something too. Thank you so much for reaching out. It's not gonna be the right fit this time. Thanks so much. Send that message, hit pass, and it just disappears from there. And they'll move on to the next one. Because the thing is, anybody who's not putting in a ton of time like that to see where the synergy does fit themselves, they don't mind the rejection, because they're playing a numbers game versus just like, hey, Dylan, this is perfect. We have to make it happen. They're not doing that. They're like, cool, I reached out to 20 people today. Hopefully one comes back. Yours doesn't have to be the one.
Yeah. Well, speaking of, with whether it's Podcasting Made Simple, your show, or PodMatch, all the things you're involved in, what is one of your favorite things that you are currently able to do?
Yeah, I really love educating. Like, that's kind of like my favorite thing. Like, getting to meet one-on-one with like a newer podcaster. Although I feel bad for me saying this, I don't get the time to do that the way I used to. I absolutely love that opportunity. So like, if I go to all the podcasting conferences, I speak at all of them, I'm super thankful for the opportunity. But my favorite thing to do at these events is find somebody who either just launched or is about to launch, and I like to sit with them for at least 30 minutes and just go back and forth with every question they might have. And I'm not claiming to have all the answers. I typically start that way. Hey, I probably don't know everything, but I have been doing this about 10 years longer than you. So let me see what I can help with. And that's really what I love, because for me, like, I'm very big on loving and serving people before anything else. And I typically don't even bring up my product like with them. They're probably not ready for it, right? But that's what really gets me excited, saying, okay, can I help you do what I did in 2 years in 2 months, right? And if I can have that opportunity, that to me is a huge blessing.
Yeah, that's great. Well, Alex, I really appreciate your time, hearing your story, talking about podcasting. I know this is super interesting for people, whether they want to do it or they're just curious how it works. As we kind of come to an end here, how can people maybe connect with you online, learn about podcasts, Podcasting Made Simple, or PodMatch, Podcasting Made Simple? How can they find you?
Yeah, Dylan, thank you again for having me. What a blessing. If you're interested in anything we've talked about, whether you're a podcast guest, podcast host, aspiring guest or host, or just want to see a bit more about it, I do have a spot that you can go to. If you go to podmatch.com/free, it'll give you 5 quick things that you can read in less than 5 minutes. It doesn't want an email address or anything like that, just to like quantify, hey, is this something I might actually be interested in, or how can I take this to the next level? And again, that's podmatch.com/free. Dylan, again, thank you so much for having me, man. I absolutely love what you're doing here.
Yeah. So check him out. Check out the Podcasting Made Simple podcast as well if you want to kind of know more nuts and bolts. Adam, or Alex, this was great. Thanks so much for being on.
Thanks again. I appreciate it.